So for a few minutes I want to focus with you on grief, and especially with Jairus here and his little daughter. Now Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue in this town, which probably meant he was a rich and influential man in the synagogue, in the church there. You can imagine him, if you want, as the kind of guy who was pretty rich and well-dressed, and probably had some assistants with him, the kind of guys that have people who hang around him with iPads and phones and things like that. The kind of man who has people. Like I have people who do that for him. But his little daughter, and maybe the kind of guy who, takes a jet to Monaco with his wife a couple of times a year just to do fun things. But not where his little daughter is concerned, who's 12 years old, and she's very precious to him. This is not something he's going to say, my daughter is on her deathbed, and he finds some minion or other to say, go and find Jesus and bring him here. She's very precious to him. He's going to go do this himself. I'm going to find Jesus. And so he leaves her, even though she's on her deathbed and she's so precious to him, he leaves her and his wife and the family. And he goes himself to find Jesus. She means that much to him. So let's be clear on that. He's not going to delegate this task to some flunky. So he goes to find Jesus, who's just gotten off the boat from last week's episode where he's been in the boat in the storm with the disciples, and there's a crowd on the shore already. And he finds Jesus and comes to him in the middle of this crowd who's already begging Jesus to heal their sick and cleanse their lepers and all that kind of stuff. And he comes to him and he says, my little daughter is dying, please come and save her. So Jesus comes with him. Now let's be clear about a couple of things too on this. First of all, there aren't any cell phones or iPads in those days for his assistants to carry and hang on to. So it's probably, as his daughter is on her deathbed and he's decided to come and look for Jesus, it's not like it's an instantaneous kind of thing. All right, it's taken him a little while to work through the crowd once he leaves the house. It takes him a little while to figure out where Jesus is. Oh yeah, he's by the lake shore and there's a crowd there, so he gets to Jesus. And he's got to work his way through the crowd, and he's got to talk to Jesus, and he's got to persuade him to do this and so forth, and they have to turn around and come. And then there's this pause while this interruption happens that we'll talk about in the later service, but let me just say it briefly. Another person comes up, and Jesus has to deal with this healing of this additional person while he's going back to help Jairus, after he's already agreed to help Jairus with his daughter. And another person comes up, so there's a pause in the process in which we presume Jairus' assistants are looking at their watches going, the clock is ticking, sir, it's time. We need to move along here if we're going to help your daughter. And when they get that all figured out and settled and they get back on track and moving toward Jairus' house, then somebody else comes. So it's probably been a little bit of time at least, and it might be that Jairus left his house, and within 5 or 10 minutes after he left his house, somebody was sent from the house. Go find Jairus and tell him it's too late. So Jairus is going to find Jesus, and somebody is 10 minutes behind him looking for him, and as they're coming back, they finally meet him. It's too late, sir. Your daughter has died. No need to bother the teacher any longer. Now, I don't know what Jairus' reaction was. Mark and Luke, who tells the story also, they don't tell us what Jairus' reaction was to the story, other than, to that news. The daughter's very precious to Jairus and his wife. They just talk about the people around them. And that's kind of where we have to sit with it, I guess, for a little bit. The people around the people who are grieving. Because that's where that's where most of us find ourselves most of the time. We all have times when we grieve losses, and when somebody that we love dies. There are times when we grieve, and there are lots of books and resources and groups and, oh my gosh, all kinds of stuff that talk about our grief. But there are a lot more times when we find ourselves near someone else who is grieving. And then we're kind of at a loss. I guess we're at a loss most of the time. But how do we do that? How do we help somebody who is grieving? How do we help somebody like Jairus, who just, his daughter is on her deathbed. What do we do? And he's just heard the news. What do we do for him? Sometimes folks come like the people who came from the house and say, you know what, sir, don't bother the master any longer. She's died. And now the clock is ticking in a different way, by the way, in that culture. The assistants are no longer, the clock is ticking, we need to get home to heal her. The clock ticks in a different way in the Jewish culture. I don't know if you knew this, but in Jesus' day, and even to this day, Jewish people don't embalm their dead. They don't go to the undertaker and say, prepare the body and so forth. What they do is, they go home, they take care of their dead person, very lovingly and tenderly, they wrap the body, and then the burial is the very next day. Not like in our general American culture where we go to the undertaker and we prepare the body, and in about 3 or 4 days after the visiting at the funeral home, then we have a funeral and then we bury the person. And in the Jewish culture, you bury the person the very next day, and then there's about 30 days of mourning and visiting and bringing in food to the house, and you visit the family and so forth. That gives the family plenty of time to grieve and mourn and say, what are we supposed to do now? And talk to people about it, and have people come in and say, how are you doing, and that kind of stuff. And in the American culture, it's like a person dies, a couple days later you have the burial, everybody has, meal back at the funeral home, and then everybody goes home, and then the family turns around and says, okay, now what? But the clock is ticking in a little different way for Jairus, because he's got to get home and help get the body of his daughter ready for burial the next day. And then all of the mourning and grieving. And so it was very common for all the neighbors, they're going to come in, they're going to bring food for about a month. And they're going to visit, and they're going to sit, and Jairus and his family is just going to take a month off to grieve and mourn, but they got to get ready to do that. And there's got to be a whole process for that. And there's going to be some people who are going to be very businesslike about that. And just like there are very people who are very businesslike about the whole grief process, even in our day. And I'm not talking about funeral directors. Okay, you expect funeral directors to be kind of businesslike about that. You want that. You need somebody to be stable and businesslike and know exactly what's going on. I'm talking about the other people who come and say, okay, we'll bring this kind of food, and so bring that kind of food, and we'll bring that. And then that person over there, will you please be in charge of the picture board? Yeah, you can do that. And then we'll make sure that cousin so-and-so comes in from town, and they'll take, so they take care of all the family arrangements, and somebody's got to do that. Okay? And that's understandable. That leaves those who need to grieve time to just kind of collapse and grieve. But then there's the other end of the scale, and that's the end of the scale that they find when they get to Jairus' house. They find all kinds of people weeping and lamenting and making all kinds of commotion. And that's the kind that we just don't like to see in our, I'll say it this way, white Western European ancestry kind of culture. Okay. That's a different ethnic style. I'll say it that way. It's not uncommon in other ethnic cultures to have people, and weeping and crying in a funeral. It is pretty uncommon in our culture, in our ethnic derivation, to see that. We don't want to see big displays of emotion. You know, stop it. Sniffle into your handkerchief, but that's all you get. You know, I don't want to see that. Take it outside. But not in Jesus' culture. Not in the culture there. There's people crying. Now see, we used to teach that in Sunday school. We used to say, well, there were professional mourners that they would hire that would come in and do all the weeping and wailing and so forth. Because, of course, in those days they didn't have iPads and, you know, and sound systems to play solemn music in the background. And they didn't have projection screens to project pictures of the person on the wall like you do in funeral. Well, that's not exactly the reason. I think the reason is because maybe there were some people who did come in to kind of professionally set the tone, but in the Bible, people lament. They cried. They gnashed their teeth. You know, there's weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. That's in the Bible. What do you think that means? That means, that means pulling of hair. That means ripping of clothes. That means raising of fists to God. That means saying, why did this happen? I mean, there's stuff in... Read the Bible. There's stuff in there that we don't read. That's about anger and grief and things like, you know, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Lamentations. That's a whole book of which we only read about half of one chapter because we can't stand reading the whole book because it's about crying and weeping and dismal stuff and being angry with God. So we read one half of one chapter in the middle of it, which says, you know, because of the Lord's great mercy we are not consumed. But the rest of it is all about, we are so upset we could tear our hair out. And some of the Psalms, I mean, if you look in the front of the hymnal, and it's always been this way in the Lutheran hymnal, it's kind of interesting. The front of the hymnal has selected songs. Okay, and they're the good ones, like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Okay, but it's interesting to see which psalms didn't make the cut. They're the ones that are about weeping and gnashing of teeth and, you know, God, that's my enemy. I wish you'd curse him and smash his teeth in with a rock and stuff like that. They didn't make the cut in the hymnal because who wants to sing that on a Sunday morning? You know? That's Psalms of lamenting. And that's real, honest, raw, emotional stuff that we're just not real comfortable with, but they were in Jesus' day and in funerals, and that's where Jesus walks in with Jairus and his family. But did you notice in the whole setup, Jairus has people on the one hand saying, you know what, it's time to stop bothering the master because it's time to start doing what we need to do to prepare for the funeral. And on the other hand, you have a whole bunch of people who are in the midst of the lamenting and whatnot. And then you have Jesus, who has a whole completely different approach to how he's going to minister to Lazarus. See, because in the midst of all of this other stuff, if you walk into a funeral, I don't know if you know what to do or not. A lot of people don't know what to do when they walk into a funeral, right? You don't know what to say, don't know what to do. When you get to the funeral home, what are we going to say, what are we going to tell them? You know, my wife and I, over the years, we've just kind of, basic level, we walk up to a person and say, I'm sorry for your loss. And then we shut up. I don't know what else to say. And I have to tell you this, I'll tell you this honestly. When my mom died, I don't remember anything anybody said. I just remember when you guys showed up. You know? And that's, you know, after all these years, I remember that you showed up. I don't remember what you said. So, it doesn't matter what we say sometimes. But Jesus has a different approach. You know, he's not all business like, what can I do for you, Lazarus? You know, how can I help? No. And he doesn't join in the screaming and the crying and the yelling and all that. What Jesus says to Jairus is, just trust me. Well, now Jairus has not become a successful leader of the synagogue by just trusting people. Okay, I mean, that's not what businessmen do, right? They don't just trust, they have to see a prospectus first, or an outline, or bullet points, or something, right? What am I trusting you for? If I'm going to invest in your proposition here, Jesus, at least give me an outline of what I'm buying. Give me a proposal or something. Jesus doesn't say that to Jairus. He just says, just trust me. And Jairus, this successful businessman, this leader of the synagogue, trusts him. And he has no idea what Jesus is about to do, because Jesus has never done what he's about to do before in his ministry. So they go to Jesus' house, or to Jairus' house. And Jesus says, okay, everybody else can leave, but Mom and Dad and my disciples. Everybody else can leave. But wait, this is the way it's always done. Yeah, well, no, we're not doing it that way right now. Everybody else just leave. And they go to where the little daughter is. And Jesus takes her by the hand and he says, get up. And he raises her from the dead. And he turns to Jairus and his wife and he says, here she is. And he turns around and walks out. Nobody's done that in Israel in hundreds of years. And Jesus does it. Which now, of course, begs the question for us. In the New Testament, Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, and he raised the son of a woman of Nain from the dead, and he raised Lazarus, his friend, who was the brother of Mary and Martha, from the dead, and I'm not sure who else he raised from the dead in his 3 years of ministry, but I don't think there were that many more, if any. So 3, maybe 4 people that he raised from the dead in his 3 years of ministry in Palestine. And we're all intelligent enough people to think there were probably more people in that area in the 3 years that Jesus ministered in Palestine who died. But we only hear that Jesus raised 3 of them from the dead. So what about all those other people who died that Jesus, we don't even know that he raised them from the dead, or even heard the prayers of their family that may have come and said, Jesus, we know that you raised those people from the dead. Why couldn't you have raised my relative from the dead? Or for that matter, come down a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand years and say to us and to our folks and our friends, Jesus, I prayed mightily for my loved one that you would do something and heal them, and now they've died. What about that when you raised this little girl? What's the deal with that? And I don't have an answer that will satisfy that. I just don't have an answer for that question that will satisfy that. Over the centuries, philosophers have tried to come up with answers, and they've come up with about 12 of them. Each of them all are inadequate head answers to that question. And if you put all 12 of them together, they come up with about an 80% satisfactory answer. That's a head answer. They make 80% head sense, but none of them are making any heart sense at all. That's all well and good, but it still doesn't answer why not my loved one. Why didn't Jesus heal the one I've been praying for? So I don't have a head answer for that. The faith answer for that is the one that Jesus gave. Trust me. Not me. Trust Jesus. Trust Jesus. Because the fact that he raised Jairus' daughter and Lazarus and that widow's son in Nain doesn't mean that he must raise everybody who died in Palestine all at once. But it does mean that he could. And it doesn't mean that he must raise everybody who is beloved by anybody. But it means that he could. So we have to trust that that's possible anyway. And the faith answer says, he may not have done it when we wanted, but trust him, because there will be a time when he will. Because in the midst of all of the lamentations and the grief and the weeping and wailing of the Old Testament, there is this. And you know this to be true because we learned it from the eagles. There is a time for everything in its season, right? And a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time for weeping and a time for joy. And there is a time for weeping and a time for that weeping to stop. And the time for weeping to stop is not when we get over it and when we work through it. But the time for the weeping to stop is when that Jesus, who can raise people from the dead, will come again in glory and raise everybody from the dead as